My fiancé's mother handed me a prenup at the rehearsal dinner, so I took off my ring, canceled the wedding, and walked away. My fiancé Alex's mother Judith handed me a prenup at our rehearsal dinner in front of 50 guests and announced that I needed to sign it before tomorrow's wedding. Alex looked confused and asked what she was talking about because we'd already discussed not having a prenup months ago. Judith said she'd taken the liberty of having one drawn up because someone needed to protect her son's interests since he was too blinded by love to think clearly. She said the document was standard and would ensure I couldn't take advantage of the family's money when things inevitably went south. She actually used those words, when not if, like our divorce was already planned. The prenup was 60 pages long and basically said I'd get nothing if we divorced for any reason, including infidelity on Alex's part. It said any children would automatically stay with Alex because he had better financial resources. It said I couldn't work for any competing companies to Alex's family business ever, even after divorce. It said I'd have to repay any gifts given during the marriage if we split. It even said I couldn't gain weight beyond 20 pounds, or it would be considered breach of contract. Judith stood there smiling while everyone read over my shoulder and said this was just smart business, and any reasonable woman would sign it. Alex grabbed the papers and started reading, his face getting redder with each page. He asked his mother what she was thinking, and she said she was thinking about protecting the family legacy from gold diggers. She looked right at me when she said gold diggers, even though I made more money than Alex and had paid for most of our wedding myself. She said women like me always showed their true colors when asked to sign reasonable agreements, and if I really loved Alex, I'd sign without hesitation. Our families were stunned into silence while Judith kept talking about how she'd seen too many good men ruined by calculating women. She said she'd hired a private investigator to look into my background, and while she hadn't found anything yet, that just meant I was better at hiding things. She said the prenup was non-negotiable, and if I refused to sign, the wedding was off because she wouldn't let her son make such a huge mistake. She'd already called the vendors to put them on standby for cancellation. Alex stood up and told his mother she had no right to do this. Judith said she had every right as the woman who raised him and funded his entire life. She reminded him that she controlled his trust fund until he was 35 and could make his life very difficult if he married the wrong person. She said I'd already started changing him, making him soft and emotional when he used to be focused on success. She claimed I was isolating him from his family, when really she meant I'd encouraged him to set boundaries with her controlling behavior. My parents were furious, and my father asked Judith who she thought she was to insult his daughter like this. Judith said she was protecting her bloodline from dilution and wouldn't apologize for being a good mother. She said my parents should be grateful their daughter was marrying up, and the prenup was generous considering I brought nothing to the marriage except debt from student loans. I actually laughed at that because I'd paid off my loans 2 years ago while Alex was still paying his. Judith demanded to know what was funny, and I said the whole situation was hilarious because she'd just saved me from marrying into her family. I thanked her for showing me exactly what my life would be like with her as a mother-in-law, and said the wedding was definitely off, but not because I wouldn't sign her prenup. I said it was off because no amount of love for Alex was worth dealing with her for the next 40 years. I took off my engagement ring and put it on the table next to the prenup. Alex begged me to reconsider and said we could work this out. I asked him if he was willing to cut his mother out of our lives completely, and he hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I said he needed to decide if he wanted to be a husband or remain his mother's little boy forever. Judith started screeching that I was manipulating her son, and this proved she was right about me. The rehearsal dinner ended with me walking out, my family following, and Alex standing between his mother and the door looking lost. The next morning, which should have been our wedding day, I sent messages to all the guests explaining that the wedding was canceled due to irreconcilable differences with Alex's family. I didn't give details, but enough people had witnessed the rehearsal dinner that word spread quickly about what Judith had done. The vendors were furious when they found out Judith had called them preemptively about cancellation, because it showed she'd planned this ambush. Several refused to refund her deposits since she'd acted in bad faith. The wedding venue sued her for the full amount since she'd technically breached contract by sabotaging the event. Within a week, Judith's reputation in their social circle was destroyed, because everyone was talking about how she'd humiliated her son's fiancé with a surprise prenup at the rehearsal dinner. I woke up in my childhood bedroom and stared at the ceiling with the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck up there when I was 12. My phone sat on the nightstand buzzing every few minutes with new messages and calls. I picked it up and saw 63 notifications, most of them from Alex begging me to call him back or just talk for 5 minutes. I couldn't make myself open any of the texts, because seeing his words would make everything hurt worse than it already did. My mom knocked softly and came in with coffee in my favorite mug from high school, the one with the chipped handle that said, "World's okayest daughter," that Otto had given me as a joke. She sat on the edge of my bed and didn't say anything, just handed me the coffee and waited while I tried to figure out how to explain what I was feeling. The wedding was supposed to happen today, and instead I was back in my childhood room surrounded by old posters and stuffed animals, drinking coffee and trying not to cry. My mom finally asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I shook my head because talking would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to handle yet. She squeezed my hand and said she'd be downstairs when I was ready, then left me alone with my coffee and my phone that wouldn't stop buzzing with messages I couldn't read. Talia showed up around noon with bags of Chinese takeout and 2 bottles of wine, kicking my bedroom door open with her foot because her hands were full. She dumped everything on my bed and announced we were going to deal with the practical stuff today because putting it off would just make everything worse. We sat cross-legged on my bed with containers of lo mein and fried rice spread between us while she pulled out a notebook and started making a list of everything that needed handling. The apartment lease I shared with Alex was in both our names and had 8 months left on it. All my stuff was still there, mixed in with his stuff and our stuff. 3 years of living together packed into 900 square feet. The honeymoon tickets to Costa Rica were non-refundable and left in 2 weeks. The wedding gifts people had already sent needed to be returned with notes explaining why. My name was on half the utilities and the internet bill and the joint checking account we'd opened to pay for wedding expenses. Talia wrote everything down in her neat handwriting while I just sat there feeling sick about how complicated breaking up actually was when you'd been planning to get married. She took my phone and started answering calls from vendors asking about final payments and delivery schedules, telling them in her professional voice that the wedding was canceled and they should direct all questions to the groom's family. I picked at my food and listened to her handle everything because I couldn't make my brain work well enough to deal with any of it myself. The wedding planner called Talia's phone since I wasn't answering mine and put the call on speaker so we could both hear. She had an update that actually made me feel slightly better about the whole disaster. 3 of the major vendors were refusing to refund Judith's deposits because her preemptive cancellation calls counted as breaking the contract on her end. The florist had already ordered $2,000 worth of flowers based on our confirmed order, and Judith calling to put them on standby meant she'd interfered with their business relationship with us. The caterer had purchased all the food for our reception and now had to scramble to either use it or lose it, so they were keeping their $8,000 deposit as damages. The venue was actually moving forward with a lawsuit against Judith for the full contract amount of $35,000 because she'd basically sabotaged an event she'd legally committed to hosting by calling them before I'd even made my decision. The wedding planner explained that vendors take these contracts seriously, and Judith trying to control the situation before it was actually canceled gave them grounds to refuse refunds. She said she'd never seen anything like it in 15 years of planning weddings. Someone actually calling vendors to threaten cancellation while the bride and groom were still at the rehearsal dinner. I felt a mean little spark of satisfaction knowing that Judith's need to control everything was finally costing her real money instead of just costing other people their peace of mind. Otto showed up that evening with his pickup truck and a bunch of empty boxes in the back. He walked into my room and said we were getting my stuff out of the apartment today before things got messier or more complicated. I started to say maybe we should wait or I should talk to Alex first. But Otto cut me off and said waiting would just make it harder, and I needed my things out of there so I could start moving forward. I was grateful he wasn't asking if I was sure about the breakup, or suggesting maybe I should reconsider, or telling me that all couples have problems. He just helped me get dressed in real clothes instead of the pajamas I'd been wearing all day, then drove us to the apartment I'd shared with Alex for the past 2 years. Walking through the door felt wrong because this had been my home, and now it was just a place I needed to get my stuff from as fast as possible. Otto started in the bedroom, pulling my clothes out of the closet we'd shared and folding them into boxes. I packed up the bathroom, sorting through drawers full of mixed-together toiletries and trying not to cry over stupid things like the electric toothbrush we'd bought together or the fancy shampoo Alex always said made my hair smell good. Every shared item reminded me of some moment or conversation or lazy Sunday morning, all these little pieces of a life we'd been building that was just over now. Otto found me standing in the bathroom holding a bottle of body wash and crying, and he took it from my hands and packed it himself while I pulled myself together enough to keep going. Alex came home while we were still packing up the living room, and the look on his face when he saw the boxes almost broke me completely. He stood in the doorway with his keys still in his hand and asked if we could please just talk alone for a minute. Otto looked at me to see what I wanted, and I nodded. So he stepped outside, but I could see him through the window staying close to the door in case I needed him. Alex sat down on the couch and said his mother had agreed to apologize to me and promised to stay completely out of our lives if I'd reconsider calling off the wedding. I sat in the chair across from him instead of next to him and asked if he really believed Judith would keep that promise. He said she'd given him her word and she understood she'd gone too far this time. I asked him if she'd ever kept her word before when she promised not to interfere in his life or his decisions. He got quiet, and I could see him trying to think of an example that would prove me wrong. I asked if he honestly thought his mother would just accept our marriage and leave us alone, or if he thought she'd find new ways to control and manipulate us once we were legally tied together. He said we could set boundaries and make it work if we both tried hard enough. I knew right then that I'd made the right choice, even though it hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt before. Alex couldn't answer my question about whether he believed his mother would really stay out of our lives because deep down he knew she wouldn't. He admitted that Judith had always been controlling and invasive and impossible to stand up to for more than a few weeks before she wore him down. She'd sabotaged his college relationship by convincing his girlfriend's parents he was irresponsible with money. She'd gotten him fired from his first job out of college because she didn't think it was prestigious enough, and called his boss pretending to be concerned about his drinking problem even though he barely drank. She'd made his last girlfriend so miserable with constant criticism and boundary violations that the poor woman had a breakdown and moved to another state. Alex told me all this like he was just explaining facts about his life, not recognizing that these were huge red flags about what our marriage would be like. I said I loved him, but I couldn't marry someone who wouldn't protect our marriage from his mother's interference. I told him he needed to figure out who he wanted to be, a husband who put his wife first, or a son who would always choose his mother's approval over his partner's well-being. He started crying and said that wasn't fair. I was asking him to choose between the two most important people in his life. I said no. His mother was asking him to choose by making it impossible for him to have both a relationship with her and a healthy marriage to anyone. Otto and I finished loading my stuff into his truck while Alex sat on the couch looking destroyed. I found my apartment key on my keyring and held it in my hand for a minute, feeling like I was closing a door on the entire future I'd imagined for myself. I'd pictured us growing old in this apartment or maybe buying a house nearby, having kids who would play in that park down the street, building a whole life together in this neighborhood. Now I was handing back the key and walking away from all of it because his mother had shown me exactly what that life would actually be like. I gave Alex the key and he took it without saying anything, just looked at me like he was memorizing my face. Otto carried the last box down to the truck and I followed him, closing the apartment door behind me for the last time. My brother drove me back to our parents' house and helped me carry everything up to my childhood bedroom, where it barely fit between my old furniture. I spent that night crying into the same pillow I'd used in high school, the one with the faded floral pattern that my mom had bought me for my 13th birthday. I woke up the next morning and had to face the reality that I needed to find a new apartment and rebuild my entire life from nothing. Work on Monday was awful because several of my coworkers had been invited to the wedding and everyone knew it got canceled. People kept giving me these sympathetic looks in the hallway or the break room, then quickly looking away when I made eye contact like they didn't want to make things worse by acknowledging what happened. Rohit stopped by my desk mid-morning with coffee and said he was sorry things fell apart the way they did. I appreciated that he didn't ask for details or offer advice about relationships or tell me everything happens for a reason. He just said if I needed anything at all, even just someone to vent to or help with a project to distract myself, I should let him know. I thanked him and meant it, because his simple kindness without prying felt like the first normal human interaction I'd had since the rehearsal dinner disaster. I threw myself into a big analysis project I'd been putting off, spending 8 hours building spreadsheets and running reports because focusing on work kept me from thinking about my personal life falling apart. My boss stopped by around 3 to check in and said she'd heard about the wedding cancellation and wanted me to know I could take some personal time if I needed it. I told her I'd rather work because sitting at home just made everything worse, and she nodded like she understood and said to let her know if that changed. Judith called my phone directly on Tuesday afternoon while I was in a meeting. I sent it to voicemail and tried to focus on the presentation my coworker was giving about third quarter projections. When the meeting ended, I saw she'd left a message and I almost deleted it without listening. Something made me hit play though, maybe just needing to know what she'd say after everything she'd done. Her voicemail managed to be both an apology and an accusation in the same breath. She said she was sorry I took her prenup suggestion so personally, and she was only trying to protect her son from making a mistake. She said clearly I was too immature to understand a mother's love and the lengths a parent would go to keep their child safe. She hoped someday, when I had children of my own, I'd look back and realize she was just doing what any good mother would do. The message made me so angry I had to grab my keys and go sit in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes just to calm down enough to go back to work. I played the message 3 more times, getting angrier each time at her complete inability to see that she'd done anything wrong. She was apologizing for my reaction to her behavior, not for the behavior itself, which wasn't actually an apology at all. My dad suggested that evening that I should talk to a lawyer about whether Judith's actions caused me any recoverable damages. He pointed out that I'd paid for most of the wedding myself, almost $40,000 between the dress and the venue deposit and the photographer and 100 other expenses. If we could prove Judith deliberately sabotaged the wedding to cause me financial harm, maybe I could recover some of that money. I made an appointment with a lawyer for Thursday afternoon and spent 2 hours going through all my wedding expenses and emails and text messages to document everything. The lawyer was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who listened to my whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she explained that while Judith's behavior was horrible and cruel, I probably didn't have much legal standing for a lawsuit. I'd have to prove she intentionally sabotaged the wedding specifically to cause me financial harm, not just that her behavior led to the cancellation. Since I was the one who technically called off the wedding by walking out, it would be hard to argue that Judith caused my damages rather than my own choice causing them. The consultation cost me $300 I didn't really have right now with all my wedding expenses already draining my savings, which just added to my anger and frustration about the whole situation. That weekend, Talia picked me up in her car and we drove around looking at apartments I could actually afford on my own. The first place had mold in the bathroom and a landlord who kept staring at my chest while he showed us around. The second place was nice but wanted first month, last month, security deposit, and a pet deposit even though I don't have pets, which added up to more than I had in my checking account. The third place was a 1-bedroom on the second floor of an older building with carpet that had seen better days and a kitchen the size of a closet. But the rent was $800 a month and the landlord seemed normal. I filled out the application right there while Talia looked in the cabinets and tested the water pressure. The landlord called my references that same afternoon, and by Monday I had approval to move in on the 1st of next month. I signed the lease in his office and handed over a check for the security deposit that my parents had transferred into my account that morning, and when I walked out with my copy of the lease, I felt like I might throw up. This was real now. This was my apartment, just mine. Proof that the life I'd planned with Alex was actually over, and I was starting from scratch. Talia took me out for ice cream after and told me this was a good thing, even though it didn't feel good yet. That having my own place meant I could build exactly the life I wanted without compromising. I wanted to believe her, but mostly I just felt sad and scared about living alone for the first time in 3 years. 2 weeks after the canceled wedding, my phone buzzed with a text from Alex asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. I stared at the message for 10 minutes, trying to decide if I should ignore it or block his number or what. And then I texted back that we could meet Thursday at 3 at the coffee shop near the library. Part of me knew this was stupid and I should just move on. But another part of me needed to see him one more time. Needed to know if he'd figured anything out, or if he was still the same guy who hesitated when I asked if he'd cut his mother out. Thursday came and I got there 5 minutes early, ordered my usual latte, and sat at a table by the window where I could see him coming. He walked in looking terrible, like he hadn't been sleeping much, with circles under his eyes and his hair longer than he usually kept it. He ordered black coffee and sat down across from me and immediately started talking about how much he missed me, how the apartment felt empty without me, how he kept forgetting I wasn't there and would turn to tell me something before remembering I was gone. I listened without saying much, and watched his hands shake a little when he picked up his coffee cup. Alex told me he'd been setting boundaries with his mother, and she was starting to understand she went too far with the prenup thing. I asked him what boundaries specifically, and he said he wasn't taking her calls every day anymore, and he'd told her she needed to apologize to me. I asked how she responded to that, and he got vague, saying she was processing everything and coming around slowly. I asked if he'd told her he wouldn't have a relationship with her unless she respected his choices, and he said he was working up to that conversation. I asked if he was still working at the family business, and he said yes, but he was thinking about looking for other jobs. I asked if he'd moved out of the apartment his parents helped him pay for, and he said not yet, but he was considering it. Every answer he gave me was soft and conditional, full of words like thinking and considering and working toward, and I realized he was still in the exact same place he'd been at the rehearsal dinner. When I pointed this out, he got defensive and said I wasn't being fair about how hard this was for him, that I didn't understand what it was like to have a mother like Judith, that he was doing the best he could. I said I knew it was hard, but avoiding her calls wasn't the same as setting real boundaries, and thinking about maybe looking for another job wasn't the same as actually reducing his financial dependence on his family. I put my coffee down and looked at Alex and told him I needed him to understand something important. I said I didn't walk away because of one terrible prenup or one awful rehearsal dinner. I walked away. Because when I asked if he'd cut his mother out of our lives completely, he hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage would be like. I said he was still hesitating now, still trying to find some middle ground where he could keep both his mother and me happy, and that middle ground didn't exist because his mother would never accept me and would never stop trying to control his life. I said I loved him, but I couldn't marry someone who wouldn't protect our relationship from his mother's constant interference, and until he was ready to make real changes and not just talk about maybe making changes someday, we didn't have a future together. He looked like I'd hit him and said he was trying so hard, and it wasn't fair that I was giving up on him. I said I wasn't giving up on him. I was choosing myself, and those were two different things. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, and then he asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind. And I said no, not unless he was ready to cut his mother out completely starting today, and we both knew he wasn't ready for that. He walked out looking destroyed, and I sat there alone finishing my coffee and feeling completely drained, like that conversation had taken every bit of energy I had left. Moving day came, and Otto showed up with his truck to help me transport my stuff to the new apartment. Most of what Alex and I had collected together stayed with him because it was his family's furniture, or things his mother had bought for us, which meant I was moving in with just my clothes, my books, my laptop, and a few kitchen items I'd brought to the relationship. The apartment looked empty and depressing with just my boxes stacked in the corners, and no furniture except the cheap bed frame I'd ordered online. Otto helped me assemble a bookshelf from the discount store and a small table with 2 chairs, and Talia showed up later with some throw pillows and a plant and a framed print for the wall to make it feel less like a prison cell. That first night, I sat on the floor eating pizza straight from the box because I didn't have a couch yet, and I looked around at my sad little apartment and wondered if I'd made a huge mistake throwing away a relationship over family drama. Maybe I should have tried harder to make it work with Alex. Maybe I should have been more patient while he figured out how to deal with his mother. Maybe I was being too harsh expecting him to choose between us. The thoughts spiraled in my head until I felt sick, and had to remind myself that his hesitation at the rehearsal dinner had told me everything I needed to know. That I deserved someone who would choose me without hesitating. That being alone was better than being in a relationship where I'd always come second to his mother. 3 weeks after the canceled wedding, my mom forwarded me a social media post from someone named Carol Winters, who was apparently one of Judith's close friends. The post didn't name me directly, but it was obviously about me, talking about entitled young women these days who don't appreciate generous families and make impulsive decisions that ruin good men's lives. It said some women only care about money and status, but when asked to sign a reasonable prenup, they show their true colors and run away. The post had dozens of comments from other people in Judith's social circle, all agreeing and sharing similar stories about gold diggers and ungrateful women who didn't know a good thing when they had it. As I read through the comments, feeling my face get hot with anger and shame, seeing strangers discuss my failed relationship like they knew anything about what happened. My mom called right after she sent it and said she was furious that these people were spreading lies about me, and I said I was more than furious. I was humiliated that Judith was running a whole reputation campaign to make me look bad. Talia spent that evening finding more posts from Judith's friends, all saying basically the same thing without using my name. They painted me as a gold digger who walked away when asked to sign a reasonable prenup, completely ignoring the fact that I made more money than Alex and had paid for most of our wedding myself. One post talked about women who manipulate men by pretending to be independent, but really just want access to family money. Another post said young women today don't understand commitment and bail at the first sign of difficulty. The comments were even worse, full of people I'd never met agreeing that women like me were destroying good men and families. I showed Talia a post that had over 100 comments, and she said these people were trash and their opinions didn't matter, but it was hard not to feel the sting of having strangers believe lies about me. The worst part was knowing the truth didn't matter to these people because they'd already decided Judith was right and I was wrong, and nothing I could say would change their minds about me. My first therapy appointment happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and I spent an hour telling this woman I'd never met about the rehearsal dinner disaster and the canceled wedding and now the social media campaign. She listened without interrupting, and then asked how I was handling my anger about the posts. I said I was furious and humiliated and wanted to respond publicly to set the record straight. She pointed out that I couldn't control what Judith said, or what her friends believed, but I could control whether I engaged with it, or let it eat me alive. She said responding publicly would just feed the drama and give these people more ammunition to use against me. I knew she was right, but it still made me angry that I had to take the high road while Judith got to trash my reputation with lies. We talked about healthy ways to process anger, and she suggested I write out everything I wanted to say to Judith and her friends, but not send it. Just get it out of my system. I left feeling slightly better, but still burning with the knowledge that people believed lies about me, and I was supposed to just accept that. Work got complicated when someone from accounting stopped by my desk and mentioned that Enrique's company was one of our clients. She asked if it was weird working on accounts connected to my ex's family, and I said I wasn't working on that account. And she said, oh good, because she'd heard from someone that I used to be engaged to their son, and she wondered if that would be awkward. I felt my stomach drop because I hadn't realized people at work knew about the connection, and I definitely hadn't wanted it brought up in the office. Later that afternoon, my boss called me into her office and asked if there was going to be any awkwardness with the Redmond account. I assured her my personal life wouldn't affect my professional work, and I had no contact with that family anymore. She seemed satisfied, but said she needed to know if any issues came up because we couldn't afford to lose a major client over personal drama. I walked back to my desk feeling exposed and vulnerable in a place where I used to feel competent and secure, knowing that my failed relationship was now part of my professional reputation. A month after the canceled wedding, I was at the grocery store loading vegetables into my cart when someone said my name. I turned around and saw Alex's aunt standing there with her own cart, looking at me carefully like she was trying to decide whether to approach. She introduced herself as Whitney, even though we'd met several times during my relationship with Alex, and she asked if we could talk for a minute. I said okay, and we moved to the side of the produce section where we weren't blocking traffic. She told me she'd been wanting to reach out because she thought I made the right choice walking away from Alex. I must have looked surprised because she quickly added that she loved her nephew, but she'd watched Judith destroy 2 of his previous relationships with similar controlling behavior. She said one girlfriend from college had been driven away when Judith convinced the girl's parents that Alex was irresponsible with money. And another girlfriend from a few years ago had ended things after Judith showed up at her workplace to lecture her about proper behavior. Whitney said she'd watched Alex become less and less able to make his own decisions over the years, and the rehearsal dinner situation was just Judith's latest attempt to control who her son married and how he lived his life. Whitney pulled a business card from her purse and wrote her cell number on the back. She said I should call her if I wanted to talk more about any of this, and she meant it. Not like those fake offers people make when they're being polite. I took the card and turned it over in my hands, trying to figure out what her angle was. She was married to Judith's brother, which made her part of that family even if she seemed sympathetic to me. I thanked her and said I'd think about it, then watched her push her cart toward the checkout lanes while I stood there holding vegetables I'd forgotten I was buying. 3 days went by before I texted Whitney's number. I kept picking up my phone and putting it down again, wondering if this was a trap or if Judith had sent her to gather information. But I was also curious about what she knew, and honestly I needed to understand if what happened at the rehearsal dinner was normal for that family, or if it was as crazy as it felt. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my office on Thursday afternoon. I got there first and picked a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard. Whitney arrived exactly on time carrying a large folder that she set on the table between us. She ordered a latte and I got tea, and then she opened the folder and started pulling out printed Facebook posts and old photos. She said she'd been documenting Judith's behavior for years because she thought someone needed to keep a record of it. The first story she told me was about a girl named Rebecca, who dated Alex in college. Rebecca came from a normal middle-class family and was studying engineering on a scholarship. Judith decided Rebecca wasn't good enough for her son and started a campaign to break them up. She called Rebecca's parents and told them Alex was failing his classes and doing drugs, which was completely made up. She said Alex was going to lose his trust fund, and Rebecca would end up supporting him financially if they stayed together. Rebecca's parents were traditional and conservative, and they pressured their daughter to end the relationship because they didn't want her derailed by a troubled boyfriend. Alex never knew his mother was behind the breakup until years later. Whitney showed me another photo of a woman named Sarah who Alex dated about 3 years ago. Sarah worked in marketing and made decent money, but Judith decided she was too independent and wouldn't be a good wife. She showed up at Sarah's workplace during a busy afternoon and cornered her in the lobby. Judith told Sarah that Alex had a genetic condition that would make him sterile, and if Sarah wanted children, she should find someone else. This was another complete lie. But Sarah broke up with Alex that same week because she did want kids someday, and thought he'd been hiding this from her. Alex found out months later what his mother had done when he ran into Sarah at a friend's party, and she mentioned the fertility issue. Learning about these other women made my stomach hurt. I asked Whitney how many times Judith had done this, and she said at least 4 that she knew about, probably more. She explained that Judith had a pattern of waiting until Alex got serious with someone, then finding a way to sabotage the relationship before it could progress to marriage. The prenup ambush at my rehearsal dinner was just the latest version of her control tactics. Whitney said she thought Judith picked the rehearsal dinner specifically because it was public and humiliating, designed to make me walk away so Alex would see me as the one who abandoned him. I felt this weird mix of validation and sadness. Validation because it proved I wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive about what happened. Sadness because Alex had been dealing with this his whole life and probably didn't even realize how abnormal it was. Whitney confirmed that by telling me about Alex's childhood. She said Judith controlled everything from what sports he played, to what friends he could have over, to what colleges he could apply to. His father, Enrique, just went along with whatever Judith decided because it was easier than fighting with her. Alex grew up thinking this was normal parenting, that mothers were supposed to manage every aspect of their sons' lives. Whitney leaned forward and said something that really stuck with me. She said she wasn't telling me all this to convince me to go back to Alex. She said she was telling me so I would understand that what happened wasn't my fault, and it wasn't really Alex's fault either. It was the result of decades of dysfunction, and a family system where Judith's control went unchallenged. She said Alex never learned how to set boundaries with his mother because his father never modeled that behavior. Enrique had basically checked out of confronting his wife years ago, and their marriage was more like a business arrangement where Judith made all the decisions and Enrique funded them. I asked Whitney why she was telling me all this now, and her answer surprised me. She said she felt guilty for not speaking up at the rehearsal dinner when Judith ambushed me. She'd been shocked into silence like everyone else. But afterward, she kept thinking she should have said something to support me, or at least pulled Alex aside privately to tell him his mother was out of line. She said she'd watched Judith destroy too many of Alex's relationships, and she was tired of being a silent witness to it. Her honesty made me like her, and I started to think maybe she really was trying to help, rather than spy for Judith. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon. Whitney shared more stories about family dynamics and how Judith manipulated situations to maintain control. She told me about holidays where Judith would create drama if things didn't go exactly her way, about how she'd threatened to cut Alex off financially multiple times when he tried to make independent decisions. She showed me text messages where Judith berated Alex for minor things like not calling her every single day or choosing to spend time with friends instead of family dinners. By the end of our conversation, I understood that Alex was trapped in a system he didn't know how to escape. 6 weeks after the canceled wedding, I was in my new apartment on a Saturday morning making breakfast when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I was still in pajamas, so I checked the peephole before opening it. Alex stood in the hallway holding a coffee cup and looking nervous. He was dressed better than he'd been at our coffee meeting weeks ago, wearing actual jeans and a nice shirt instead of the rumpled clothes he'd had on before. I stood there for a minute trying to decide if I should open the door, then finally unlocked it and let him in. He apologized for showing up without calling first, and said he'd been working up the courage to come by for days. I gestured for him to sit on my couch, and I took the chair across from him, keeping physical distance between us. He set the coffee on my table and started talking about therapy. He said he'd been going twice a week for the past month, working specifically on his relationship with his mother and learning to set boundaries. He talked about how his therapist had helped him see patterns in his behavior, how he'd always prioritized his mother's feelings over everyone else's, including his own. He said he finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him at the rehearsal dinner about choosing between being a husband and being his mother's son. Alex spent almost an hour telling me about the work he'd been doing. He'd made a list of all the times his mother had interfered in his life and relationships. He'd practiced saying no to her in therapy sessions. He'd even confronted her about the prenup ambush and told her it was unacceptable. He said his mother hadn't taken it well, and they'd had a huge fight where she accused him of being brainwashed by therapy and ungrateful for everything she'd done for him. But he'd held firm and told her he wouldn't have a relationship with her unless she apologized to me and respected his choices going forward. The part that really got my attention was when he said they hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. He told me this was the longest he'd ever gone without talking to his mother, and it was hard, but also necessary. He looked at me with this hopeful expression and asked if there was any chance we could try again. Not jump back into being engaged, but maybe start over with dating and rebuilding trust. He said he genuinely believed he'd changed, and he understood now what had been wrong before. I could see he meant it, that he really did think he'd made progress and fixed the problems that broke us up. I told him I needed time to think about it, which was true. But even as I said it, I was noticing things about his story that bothered me. All his talk about setting boundaries was about what he'd told his mother, not about what he'd actually done to restructure his life. He was still working at the family business, still financially dependent on his trust fund that she controlled, still living in an apartment his parents owned. He hadn't made any concrete changes that would make his boundaries sustainable long-term. It felt like he'd made emotional progress in understanding the problem, but he hadn't made practical progress in solving it. After Alex left, I sat on my couch for a while just processing everything he'd said. Then I called Talia, because I needed to talk it through with someone who knew me well enough to ask hard questions. She came over that evening with Thai food and wine, and I told her about Alex's visit and his request to try again. She listened carefully while I explained all the therapy work he'd been doing and how he seemed genuinely different. Then she asked me the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. She said I needed to figure out if I actually wanted to get back together with him, or if I just missed having a partner and felt guilty about his pain. I didn't have a good answer for her, which probably was an answer itself. I told her I needed more time to think before making any decisions. Talia said that was smart and reminded me that I didn't owe Alex anything just because he was working on himself. She pointed out that him doing therapy was great for him regardless of whether we got back together, and I shouldn't feel pressured to give him another chance just because he was making changes he should have made years ago. We spent the rest of the evening watching bad movies and not talking about Alex, which was exactly what I needed. 2 months after the canceled wedding, my company's annual review cycle happened. I met with my boss and got excellent marks across the board in every category. She said my work had been consistently strong and she was impressed by how I'd handled some difficult client situations. The positive review reassured me that the Redmond family connection hadn't hurt my professional reputation the way I'd worried it might. Later that week, Rohit stopped by my desk and mentioned something that made my blood boil. He said he'd heard through the office gossip network that someone from the Redmond account had tried to make negative comments about me to my boss. Apparently they'd called and said I had personal issues that might affect my work quality. My boss had shut it down immediately and told them my personal life was completely irrelevant to my professional performance. She'd also apparently told them that if they had concerns about any employee, they needed to go through proper HR channels, not make vague accusations and phone calls. I was grateful for that protection, but furious that Judith was now trying to sabotage my career on top of everything else she'd done. I decided to be proactive about the reputation damage instead of waiting to see what other problems Judith might cause. I scheduled lunch with 3 coworkers who'd been invited to the wedding, people I worked with regularly who might have heard rumors or wondered what happened. Over salads and sandwiches, I gave them a brief professional version of what went down. I explained that Alex's mother had presented an unacceptable prenup at the rehearsal dinner, with terms I couldn't agree to, and I decided I couldn't marry into that family dynamic. I kept it factual and unemotional, focusing on the incompatibility rather than attacking Judith or making myself look like a victim. Most of them were supportive and understanding. One woman shared her own story about a difficult mother-in-law who'd made her early marriage really hard. Another guy talked about how his sister had called off a wedding 2 days before because of family issues, and it had been the right choice even though it was painful. Having these conversations made me feel less alone and less worried about what people at work thought of me. It also felt good to control my own narrative instead of letting Judith's version be the only story people heard. The following week, Talia convinced me to try something completely new. She said I needed to meet people outside of my existing circles, get involved in activities that had nothing to do with work or the wedding or any of that drama. She'd joined a recreational volleyball league that played on Wednesday nights and thought I should come try it out. I told her I was terrible at volleyball and hadn't played since high school gym class, but she said that was the whole point. It was recreational, not competitive, and the team was friendly and just wanted to have fun. I showed up to the first practice feeling awkward and out of place. The team was a mix of people in their 20s and 30s, some who were decent at volleyball and some who were as bad as me. We did drills and scrimmages for 2 hours, and I spent most of that time either missing the ball completely or hitting it in the wrong direction. But nobody cared or made me feel bad about it. They just laughed and encouraged me to keep trying. By the end of the practice, I was sweating and tired and my arms hurt, but I also felt good in a way I hadn't felt in months. For 2 hours, I'd just been a person playing a game, not someone processing a canceled wedding or dealing with family drama. It was exactly what I needed. I kept going to volleyball practice every week, and by the third session, I was starting to get the hang of serving without hitting the ball into the net. The team welcomed me like I'd been there forever, and nobody asked about my personal life or why I suddenly had so much free time on Wednesday nights. One of the guys on the team invited everyone out for drinks after practice, and I went along, feeling like maybe I could be a normal person doing normal things again. We sat at a bar talking about nothing important, and I realized I was laughing at jokes and not thinking about Alex or the wedding for whole stretches of time. It felt like progress, even though I knew I still had a long way to go before I'd really moved on from everything that happened. 10 weeks after the canceled wedding, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment with a law firm's return address I didn't recognize. I opened it standing in my kitchen and found a formal letter on expensive letterhead, demanding that I return various gifts the Redmond family had given me during my relationship with Alex. The letter included an itemized list that made my blood pressure spike as I read through it. They wanted back the diamond earrings Judith gave me for my birthday, a pearl necklace from Christmas 2 years ago, the laptop Enrique gave me. When mine died last year, a designer handbag Alex bought me for our anniversary, and several other items totaling about $15,000 according to their calculations. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't comply within 30 days, and was signed by some lawyer whose name I didn't recognize. I read it 3 times trying to figure out if this was actually happening, if Judith was really so bitter about me walking away that she was now trying to take back gifts from years ago. The letter made it clear this was her new strategy for punishing me since she couldn't control Alex anymore, or force me to sign her terrible prenup. I put the letter down on my counter and just stood there feeling a mix of rage and disbelief that she was still coming after me months after I'd already walked away from her son and her family. I called my lawyer the next morning and read her the entire letter over the phone. She asked me to scan it and send it to her office so she could review the specific language and the list of items they were demanding back. I spent my lunch break at work dealing with this instead of actually eating, scanning documents at the office printer while trying not to let my coworkers see how stressed I was. My lawyer called me back that afternoon and explained that legally, gifts given during a relationship generally don't have to be returned unless they were explicitly conditional on marriage. She said the engagement ring would normally be returned since it's a conditional gift, but I'd already given that back at the rehearsal dinner in front of 50 witnesses. The other items on Judith's list were birthday gifts, Christmas presents, and things given during the normal course of our relationship without any stated expectation that they'd be returned if we broke up. My lawyer said Judith's lawyer was probably just trying to intimidate me or hoping I'd give in to avoid the hassle of fighting back. She advised me to let her respond through her office, declining to return the items and explaining the legal basis for keeping them. The whole thing would cost me another few $100s in legal fees, but my lawyer said it was worth it to establish that I wasn't going to roll over every time Judith decided to harass me. The legal threat from Judith made me angry in a way that actually clarified my thinking about Alex's request to try again. I'd been on the fence about whether to give him another chance if he really was working on boundaries with his mother, letting myself hope that maybe we could find a way back to each other. But this letter proved that even if Alex was making progress, his mother was escalating her attacks on me and showing no signs of backing off. Getting back together with him would mean signing up for years more of this kind of harassment, legal threats, and attempts to make my life miserable. I couldn't do that to myself no matter how much I still had feelings for Alex. I sat in my apartment that evening staring at my phone and finally texted him a message I'd been avoiding sending. I told him I appreciated his efforts to work on boundaries, and I could see he was trying, but I couldn't be in a relationship where his mother was actively trying to hurt me. I said unless he was willing to go completely no contact with Judith, we didn't have a future together because I couldn't spend my life defending myself from her attacks. I hit send before I could change my mind and then put my phone down and waited for his response. Alex's reply came through about an hour later, and it was a long message that basically confirmed everything I already knew. He said he couldn't cut his mother out completely because she was still his mother, and family was important to him. He wrote several paragraphs about how he understood why I was upset, but I was being unreasonable to demand he choose between us. He said he was hurt that I wouldn't acknowledge the progress he'd made in therapy and setting boundaries. He reminded me that he'd stood up to her multiple times since the rehearsal dinner, and was working really hard to change their relationship. His message made it clear that he wanted me to accept a version of him that included his mother's presence in our lives, just with better boundaries than before. He thought that should be enough and couldn't understand why I needed him to go completely no contact. Reading his response made me sad, but also relieved because it proved I was making the right choice. He was never going to be able to give me what I needed, which was a partner who would protect our relationship from his mother's interference without me having to constantly ask for it. I wrote back a short message saying I understood his position, but it wasn't compatible with what I needed, and I wished him well. Then I did something I should have done weeks ago. I blocked Alex's number after that exchange because I needed to stop having the same conversation over and over. Every time we talked, he tried to convince me that his incremental progress should be enough, and I tried to explain why it wasn't, and we just went in circles without getting anywhere. Blocking him felt harsh but also necessary for my own mental health and ability to move forward. I called Talia right after I did it and told her what happened with the gift demand letter and my final conversation with Alex. She said she was proud of me for choosing myself over a relationship that would have made me miserable, and she insisted on taking me out for a nice dinner that weekend to celebrate. We went to this Italian place we both loved, and she ordered a bottle of wine even though it was expensive. We toasted to dodging bullets, and she made me laugh with increasingly ridiculous descriptions of what my life would have been like as Judith's daughter-in-law. She painted a picture of me having to get Judith's approval for every life decision, attending mandatory weekly dinners where Judith criticized everything I did, and eventually having kids that Judith would try to turn against me. By the end of her comedy routine, I was laughing so hard I was crying, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. 3 months after the canceled wedding, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I was starting to feel more like myself again. My apartment felt like home now that I'd decorated it with things I actually liked instead of compromising with Alex's taste. I'd established routines that were entirely mine, like making elaborate breakfasts on weekends and doing yoga in my living room before work. My job was going well, and my boss had pulled me aside the previous week to say I was considered for a promotion to senior analyst. The promotion would come with a significant raise and more responsibility, and I was excited about it in a way I hadn't been excited about anything in months. I was still processing grief and anger about how everything went down with Alex and his family, but I was also building a life that was fully mine without compromise. I didn't have to check with anyone about my plans or worry about whether my choices would upset Judith or cause problems with Alex. It was lonely sometimes, but it was also freeing in ways I hadn't expected. Whitney texted me out of the blue one afternoon asking how I was doing. I hadn't heard from her in a few weeks and was surprised she was reaching out. She said Judith's lawyer had contacted her asking her to provide a statement about gifts she'd witnessed the family giving me over the years. Whitney told me she'd refused and told the lawyer she thought the whole thing was petty and vindictive. She warned me that Judith was apparently obsessed with the idea that I'd somehow taken advantage of her family, and she wasn't going to let this go easily. Whitney said she'd heard through family gossip that Judith was telling everyone I was a gold digger who'd manipulated Alex and stolen from the family when I left. The fact that none of that was true didn't seem to matter to Judith or the people who believed her version of events. I thanked Whitney for the heads up and for refusing to help Judith build a case against me. It meant a lot that at least one person in Alex's family could see how wrong this all was. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived from Judith's lawyer, and this one was even worse than the first. They were escalating the threats and adding new claims that I'd damaged property in the apartment I shared with Alex when I moved out. The letter listed scratches on hardwood floors, marks on walls, and missing items from the kitchen that they claimed I'd taken. I was so angry I could barely see straight because every single claim was a lie. Otto had helped me move out carefully, and he'd taken photos of every room showing everything in perfect condition specifically because I was worried something like this might happen. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer along with all of Otto's photos, and she responded within a day. She sent a letter back to Judith's lawyer with the photos attached, showing everything in perfect condition, and she added that if Judith continued this harassment, we'd pursue a restraining order and file a countersuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. My lawyer said the legal posturing was exhausting and expensive for everyone involved, but we needed to show Judith that I wasn't going to back down. Each letter cost me more money I didn't really have to spare, but my lawyer assured me it was worth it to establish boundaries. My therapist helped me work through my feelings about being trapped in this ongoing conflict with Judith, even though I'd walked away from Alex months ago. I told her I felt like I couldn't escape the Redmond family no matter what I did, that Judith was determined to make me pay for rejecting her son and her control. My therapist pointed out something that actually helped me reframe the whole situation. She said Judith's continued attacks were proof that I'd made the right decision about walking away. This was who Judith was, and what my life would have been like if I'd married Alex. The only difference was that now I was dealing with her harassment as a free person, instead of as her trapped daughter-in-law. That perspective helped me feel less like a victim, and more like someone who'd successfully escaped a bad situation. I started seeing the legal letters and threats as confirmation that I'd dodged something terrible, rather than as punishment for a choice I regretted. I started casually dating someone I met through volleyball, and it felt good to remember I was capable of connecting with new people. His name was Noah, and he was funny and easy to talk to, and he knew absolutely nothing about my canceled wedding or the Redmond family drama. I liked being able to just be present in the moment with him, without all that baggage weighing me down. We went to movies and tried new restaurants and played volleyball together twice a week. It wasn't serious, and we both knew that, but it helped me see that there was life after Alex and I didn't have to be defined by that failed relationship forever. Noah made me laugh and didn't ask complicated questions about my past, and that was exactly what I needed right now, while I was still healing from everything that happened. I was sitting at my desk 3.5 months after the wedding got canceled when my lawyer called. She sounded almost cheerful when she told me Judith had dropped the gift return demand. Her own lawyer apparently advised her that she had no legal standing, and continuing would just cost her money in legal fees she'd never recover. I thanked her and hung up, feeling this weird mix of relief and suspicion. It was a small victory, sure, but I was cynical enough to wonder what Judith's next move would be. People like her didn't just give up because a lawyer told them they were wrong. They pivoted and found new ways to make your life difficult. I saved the email confirmation from my lawyer and added it to the growing file of documentation about Judith's behavior. The file was getting pretty thick at this point. 2 weeks later, my boss called me into her office and I had that instant stomach drop thinking something was wrong. Instead, she smiled and told me I was promoted to senior analyst. The raise was significant, enough that I could actually start rebuilding my savings after the wedding disaster had drained them. I tried to stay professional, but I'm pretty sure I was grinning like an idiot when I left her office. That evening, Rohit took me out for celebratory drinks at this bar downtown that made really good cocktails. We were on our second round when he mentioned casually that the Redmond account had specifically requested I not be assigned to any of their projects. My stomach dropped again, but Rohit just shrugged and said my boss had handled it by assigning me to better accounts anyway. He raised his glass and said I was too good for their business anyway. I clinked my glass against his and felt grateful that my professional life was moving forward, even while my personal life was still recovering from the wreckage. The next morning, I opened my work email and found a message from Alex. I stared at the sender name for a solid minute before I could make myself click it. He'd somehow gotten my work address, which annoyed me, but the content of the email made me forget about that. He said he was moving out of his family's company to take a job with a competitor. He wrote that he was doing it partly because of our conversations about independence and how he needed to separate his identity from his mother's control. He made it clear he wasn't asking to get back together. He just wanted me to know I had an impact on his life, and he was trying to become the person I needed him to be. I read the email 3 times, and each time it made me sadder. It was probably too late for us. Too much damage had been done and too much time had passed. But I was glad he was making changes for himself, even if those changes came too late to save what we had. 4 months after the canceled wedding, my mom called me at work sounding shaken. Judith had shown up at my parents' house demanding to speak with my father. My heart started racing and I asked if she was okay. Mom said Dad had handled it by telling Judith she wasn't welcome on their property, and if she didn't leave, he'd call the police. Judith had left, but not before shouting that I ruined her son's life, and she'd make sure everyone knows what kind of person I really am. My dad was shaken by the confrontation, which made me furious because he was in his 70s and had a heart condition. I felt guilty that my choices were affecting my family like this. I told Mom I'd come over after work and we'd figure out what to do next. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started writing. I documented everything that had happened, starting with the prenup ambush at the rehearsal dinner. I wrote about the social media campaign where Judith and her friends spread lies about me being a gold digger. I detailed the legal harassment with the gift return demand. I included the workplace interference where the Redmond account tried to get me removed from projects. And now I added Judith showing up at my parents' house making threats. It took me 3 hours to write it all down with dates and specific details. The next morning, I sent it to my lawyer, who called me back that afternoon. She reviewed everything and said if Judith did anything else, we had a strong case for a restraining order. Just having that option documented made me feel more in control of a situation that had felt completely out of control for months. 2 days later, Whitney called me. She apologized for her sister-in-law's behavior at my parents' house before I could even say hello. She sounded genuinely upset and said she'd only just heard about it from another family member. Then she told me something that surprised me. Enrique had finally had enough and told Judith she needed to stop or he was going to support Alex in cutting her off completely. Apparently, even he had limits to what he'd tolerate, and threatening my elderly father crossed a line. Whitney said the family was fracturing over this whole situation. Some people thought Judith had gone too far, while others still defended her actions at the rehearsal dinner. She wanted me to know it wasn't my fault, which made my throat tight because I'd been carrying around so much guilt about causing family drama. I told Whitney I appreciated her support, but I felt guilty about the family drama I'd caused. She cut me off firmly and said I didn't cause anything. Judith's inability to accept that her son is an adult who makes his own choices caused this. She said the family had been dysfunctional for years, and this situation just brought it to a head. People had been tiptoeing around Judith's controlling behavior for decades, and maybe it was time someone forced the issue. Her perspective helped me release some of the guilt I'd been carrying around like a heavy backpack. I wasn't responsible for fixing a family dynamic that was broken long before I came into the picture. 4.5 months after the canceled wedding, Whitney called again with an update about Alex. He'd moved into his own apartment and was actually following through on separating from his mother's control. She said he was in intensive therapy and had gone low contact with Judith. He only spoke to her once a week with strict boundaries about what topics were acceptable. I sat on my couch listening to Whitney describe Alex's progress and felt this complicated mix of emotions. I was proud of him for making those changes. It took real courage to break away from a parent who'd controlled you your whole life. But I also knew it didn't change anything for us. Too much damage had been done during those months when he couldn't choose me over his mother. The trust was broken and the relationship was over, and his growth now, while admirable, came too late to save what we had. That weekend, Talia convinced me to take a trip to the beach. It was something I'd been too busy to do when I was wedding planning and then too sad to do after the cancellation. We drove 3 hours to this little coastal town and spent 2 days eating good food and lying in the sun. We walked on the beach and played in the waves and talked about everything except the Redmond family. On the second day, Talia said she'd noticed I seemed lighter lately. She said I seemed less weighed down by anger and grief than I had been even a month ago. I realized she was right. I was healing even though the process had been messy and slow and painful. The canceled wedding didn't consume my thoughts every minute anymore. I could go hours without thinking about Alex or Judith or what could have been. When I got back from the beach trip, I found a handwritten letter from Judith in my mailbox. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened because I didn't want to deal with whatever poison she'd written. But curiosity won, and I opened it standing right there by the mailboxes. It wasn't an apology. It was a long explanation of how much she sacrificed for Alex, and how she was only trying to protect him from making a mistake. She went on for 3 pages about her duties as a mother, and how she'd always put her son's interests first. She ended by saying she hoped someday I'd understand what it means to be a mother, and forgive her. I read it twice, and then I laughed because even Judith's attempt at reconciliation was about justifying her behavior, rather than taking responsibility for it. I printed out the letter and brought it to my therapy session the next day. My therapist read through it carefully while I sat there picking at my cuticles and waiting for her reaction. She looked up and asked what I noticed about the letter's content. I said it was basically Judith explaining why she did what she did without actually apologizing. My therapist nodded and pointed out that even Judith's attempt at reconciliation was about justifying her behavior rather than taking responsibility for it. She went through specific phrases that showed Judith was still centered on her own perspective and feelings rather than acknowledging the harm she caused. My therapist asked how I wanted to respond, and I opened my mouth to discuss options but then stopped. I realized I didn't want to respond at all. Engaging with Judith just kept me tied to this drama, and what I actually wanted was to close this chapter completely. I told my therapist I was done giving Judith any more of my energy or attention. When I got home, I put the letter in a file folder with all the other documentation from the wedding disaster and decided that's where it stays. I filed it away in my closet behind my winter coats, where I wouldn't see it unless I specifically went looking. That small action of putting Judith's words away felt more powerful than any response I could have written. 5 months after the canceled wedding, I went to a work happy hour at this bar downtown that my team liked. I was standing near the appetizer table talking to someone from accounting when I saw Alex across the room. He was with a group of people I didn't recognize, and for a second we just made eye contact. He walked over and we had this awkward but civil conversation where he told me his new job was in the same downtown area as my office. I told him about my promotion to senior analyst, and he said he'd heard through mutual connections that I was doing well. There was still affection between us when we talked. I could feel it in the way he smiled at certain things I said, and how I noticed he still did this thing where he rubbed the back of his neck when he was nervous. But there was also this clear sense that we were different people now. We'd been shaped by the crisis we went through separately, and we'd both moved forward in our own directions. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about work and safe topics before the conversation naturally wound down. When we said goodbye, it felt friendly but final. I watched him walk back to his group and realized I felt okay about seeing him. No anger, no longing, just this peaceful acceptance that we used to be important to each other, and now we weren't. The guy I'd been casually dating from volleyball started becoming something more serious over the next few weeks. We'd been seeing each other for about 2 months, and it felt different from anything I'd experienced before. One Sunday, I brought him to my parents' house for dinner. My mom made her special lasagna, and my dad did his usual routine of asking slightly embarrassing questions. After dinner, when we were doing dishes, my mom asked if I was worried about getting hurt again. I explained that I learned important things from the Alex situation about what I need in a partner. I needed someone who's already done the work of separating from their family, who has clear boundaries, who chooses me consistently without hesitation. This new person checked those boxes in ways Alex never could. He lived in his own apartment that he paid for himself. He had a normal relationship with his parents where they respected his decisions, and when his mom had made a comment about us moving too fast, he'd shut it down immediately. My dad nodded and said he seemed like a good guy. My mom hugged me and said she was glad I hadn't let what happened with Alex make me afraid of trying again. Whitney called me a few days later and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch. We went to the sandwich place near her office, and she told me Judith has finally accepted that Alex isn't coming back to the family business or her control. Apparently, she's telling people that her son has been brainwashed by therapy, and she's grieving the loss of their close relationship. Whitney rolled her eyes at this characterization and said Judith was painting herself as the victim in every conversation. But at least Judith had stopped actively trying to interfere in Alex's life, which meant she was probably done harassing me too. Whitney said Enrique had apparently given Judith an ultimatum after the incident at my parents' house. Either she stopped the vendetta against me, or he was going to seriously consider divorce. That threat had been enough to make Judith back off, even though she was still bitter about the whole situation. I thanked Whitney for keeping me updated, and she said she hoped we could stay friends, even though the connection to her family was over. I agreed, because I genuinely liked her, and she'd been supportive when she didn't have to be. And I was getting ready for work one morning when I realized I hadn't thought about the canceled wedding or the Redmond family drama in several days. That felt like real progress. My life had filled up with new experiences and new relationships and new goals that had nothing to do with Alex or what could have been. I was focused on a big project at work that could lead to another promotion. I was playing volleyball twice a week and getting actually decent at it. I was seeing someone who made me feel valued without making me fight for basic respect. When I did think about the wedding disaster now, I felt sad about the time I lost, but grateful I got out before making a permanent legal commitment to that family dysfunction. The sadness was softer now, less sharp and consuming. It felt like something that happened to me rather than something that was still happening to me. 6 months after the canceled wedding, I had dinner at my parents' house on a random Tuesday. We were eating my mom's pot roast when my dad said he was proud of how I'd handled everything. He admitted he was worried after the rehearsal dinner that I'd be bitter or closed off to new relationships. But instead, I'd built a good life for myself and stayed open to new possibilities. My mom added that watching me choose self-respect over a relationship that would have diminished me was one of her proudest moments as a parent. She said a lot of people would have gone back to Alex out of fear or pressure, or just because it was easier than starting over. I felt myself getting emotional and had to blink back tears. I told them I couldn't have done it without their support and Otto's help moving my stuff, and just knowing they believed in my decision. My dad reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "That's what family does." We sat there for a minute in this comfortable silence before my mom started telling a story about her own mother and a terrible boyfriend she almost married in her 20s. I was at volleyball the following week when Talia mentioned that mutual friends saw Alex at a party with a new girlfriend. She said someone he apparently met through his therapy group. I waited for the stab of jealousy or regret, but mostly I just felt relieved. He was moving on too, which meant we were both going to be okay. Talia asked if I wanted to know more details, and I realized I genuinely didn't. That lack of curiosity felt like the clearest sign that I'd healed. 6 months ago, I would have wanted to know everything about this new girlfriend, and would have compared myself to her, and wondered what she had that I didn't. Now I just felt glad that Alex found someone and hoped it worked out better for him this time. Talia smiled and said I'd come a long way. We went back to practicing our serves, and I felt lighter than I had in months. My relationship kept developing in healthy ways, and we started talking about moving in together eventually. Not immediately, but maybe in 6 months or a year when we'd been together longer. I was cautious because of what happened with Alex. I didn't want to rush into something and ignore red flags because I was excited about the relationship. But I also noticed how different this felt. There was no family drama. There were no boundary issues. There was no sense that I was competing with anyone for his attention or loyalty. He met my family and they liked him, which mattered to me more than I expected it would. Otto pulled me aside after one dinner and said this guy seemed solid and way better than Alex ever was. My brother's approval meant something because Otto had seen me at my worst after the canceled wedding and knew what I'd been through. I got a text from Whitney saying that Alex got engaged to his new girlfriend. She said Judith was apparently being civil about it because Enrique threatened to divorce her if she interferes again. Whitney added that she hoped I was doing well, and she was grateful our paths crossed even under difficult circumstances. I wrote back wishing Alex happiness and meaning it. We weren't right for each other, but I hoped he found someone who fits better with his family situation, or maybe someone whose presence finally made him strong enough to set real boundaries with his mother. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore, and I felt genuinely happy for him. That ability to wish him well without bitterness felt like the final piece of healing I needed. 6 months after the canceled wedding, I was sitting in my apartment working on a presentation for work. It was a regular Wednesday evening, and I had the windows open because the weather was nice. I looked up from my laptop and around my apartment at the life I'd built, the furniture I'd picked out myself, the photos on the walls from the beach trip with Talia and family dinners and volleyball games, the quiet space that was completely mine without compromise. I realized I was genuinely happy. Not in a dramatic everything is perfect way, but in a quiet, stable way where my life felt like it was mine, and I was building something real. The canceled wedding was devastating when it happened. Walking away from Alex hurt more than almost anything I'd experienced. But it led me to this place where I know my worth and won't settle for relationships that require me to compromise my boundaries. I saved the presentation and closed my laptop, feeling grateful for Judith's prenup ambush in a weird way because it showed me who I was marrying into before I made it legal. I walked into my therapist's office for what we both knew would be our last session. She smiled when I sat down and said she'd been thinking about how far I'd come since that first appointment 6 months ago when I could barely talk about the rehearsal dinner without crying. We spent the hour reviewing everything I'd worked through, all the tools I'd developed for handling stress and setting boundaries. She told me she was impressed by how I'd handled everything, that walking away from Alex took real courage, surviving Judith's harassment took serious resilience, and rebuilding my life took genuine faith in myself. I thanked her for helping me see that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary, and she reminded me that I'd done all the hard work. She just helped me see what I was already capable of. When I left her office, I felt ready to keep moving forward without needing that weekly support anymore. The following Saturday, Talia texted me to come over to her place for what she said was just a casual hangout. I showed up in jeans and a t-shirt, completely unprepared for the 20 people crammed into her living room, holding drinks and wearing party hats. A banner across the wall read, 6 months of freedom, and I started laughing because of course Talia would throw me a party celebrating my canceled wedding. My volleyball team was there, several work friends, and Otto had driven in from 2 hours away. People took turns sharing toasts about my strength and resilience, telling stories about how I'd inspired them to set better boundaries in their own lives. I realized I had this whole community of support that had nothing to do with romantic relationships, people who valued me just for being me. Otto gave a speech about how proud he was of his little sister for knowing when to walk away, for choosing self-respect over a relationship that would have slowly destroyed her. I cried happy tears while everyone cheered, feeling more loved and supported than I'd felt in years. Talia brought out a cake she'd made herself, decorated with little fondant figures of a woman walking away from a church. Everyone gathered around singing while I stood there taking it all in, this life I'd built from the wreckage of my canceled wedding. As I leaned forward to blow out the candles, I thought about how different everything was from what I'd imagined 6 months ago. I wasn't married to Alex, wasn't part of the Redmond family, didn't get the wedding or the future I'd planned so carefully. But I had my self-respect intact, had genuine happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval, had a life built entirely on my own terms without compromise. The choice I made at that rehearsal dinner saved me from years of misery under Judith's control, and I was grateful every single day that I'd been strong enough to walk away. I blew out the candles and made a wish for continued courage to keep choosing myself, no matter what came next.